Deputy Cole leaned on the hitching post, his shadow stretching long against the red dust of Pecan Street. The sun, a brutal orange, was bleeding into the horizon, casting the desert in a final, fiery show. Cole whistled a low, tuneless song, his eyes fixed on the empty chair in the middle of the street, the one they called the sheriff's spot. Sheriff Gideon had been in that chair for a lifetime, or so it felt. Now, it was just another piece of kindling, a splendid monument to a man who lived and breathed the quiet rust of this town. Cole glanced toward the jailhouse, its stone walls a cool gray mass against the heat, and knew the sheriff was inside, staring at a map that meant nothing to anyone but him. Gideon wasn't a man of many words. His face, etched with lines like the cracked bed of a dry river, held a silent history that no one dared to ask about. The failure that had haunted him, a young woman lost to a canyon ambush years back, was a ghost that walked between them, unspoken. It lived in the way his hand lingered over his pistol, not in anger, but in a kind of weary vigilance. When he spoke, it was in clipped sentences, like stones dropping into a deep well, and you had to listen hard for the echo of what he meant. The last few weeks, that well had gotten even deeper. The map, a tattered piece of hide with strange symbols, had arrived in a plain canvas sack with a Comanche boy, no more than 10, found wandering near a box canyon. The boy, who called himself Hachoz, had a quiet stillness about him, a wary intelligence in his dark eyes. He didn't speak a word of English, but he clung to that map like it was a part of his own skin. Gideon had tried to get him to let go of it, gently at first, then with a hint of the old frustration, but the boy's grip remained iron. Hachoz spent his days in the small back room of the jail, drawing in the dirt with a stick. He'd create intricate designs of buffalo and horses, but always, there was the same spiraling symbol from the map. It was a compulsion, a silent conversation with a secret only he understood. Gideon would stand in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light, watching the boy's small, quick hands. He saw something in those hands, in the focused tilt of the boy's head, that he recognized. A solitary purpose, a hunger for a destination. The boy's fingers moved with a precise, almost tender rhythm, carving the same patterns of a coiled snake and a rising sun, a language only he knew. Gideon's want was simple, and in this world hopelessly complex, to make things right, not with the world or with the law, but with himself. The ghost of the girl he couldn't save was a constant companion, a silent weight that had settled in his bones. He saw her face sometimes in the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, her quiet smile before the ambush. He could still feel the cold sweat on his palms, the way his muscles had locked, the single precious second of hesitation that had cost a life. The map offered a flicker of hope, a chance to build a future for this boy, to find the lost gold mine, and perhaps a path to absolution. But the thought was a bitter one, a dream too fragile to speak aloud. He knew the land, the brutal, beautiful lie it told, and he knew that every myth of gold was paved with desperation and bad blood. Still, he found himself pulling the map from its tin box every night, tracing the spiraling lines with a calloused finger. He told himself it was about the boy, about finding him a home, but the truth was, he was searching for a way to silence the ghost. That night the air hung heavy and still. Gideon sat at his desk, the kerosene lamp casting a pool of warm light on the worn grain of the wood. The map lay open before him, a puzzle he couldn't solve. The markings were unlike any he'd ever seen, a language of ridges and symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under the light. He ran his thumb over a crude drawing of a coiled snake, a detail he hadn't noticed before, and felt a quiet dread settle in his gut. This wasn't a game, and it wasn't a folktale. This was a story with sharp teeth and a long memory. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest, and closed his eyes. The failure was a fresh wound again, The memory of her small, pale hand reaching for him as the ambush exploded around them. He'd frozen, just for a second, and that second had cost everything. A single bullet, the crack of a rifle, the fall. He could still hear the sound of the dirt as she hit the ground. He had saved others, but he had failed the one who mattered most. The shame was a constant companion. A small sound of soft scraping from the back room broke the silence. Gideon pushed the map aside and stood, his joints complaining. He found Hachoz asleep on his cot, the boy's hands curled into fists, still holding the map. It had fallen from the tin box, and the boy in his sleep had found it. Gideon knelt and gently tried to pull it from his grasp. The boy's eyes, black pools in the dim light, opened. He didn't struggle. He just stared at Gideon, a question in his gaze that was as old and deep as the land itself. Gideon sat on the floor beside the cot. He wasn't sure what he was doing, what he was going to say. He held up his hand, palm open, and then pointed to the map. "Gold," he said, the word a gravelly whisper. He pointed to himself. "Find." He knew it was useless. He was talking to a wall. But the boy didn't look away. He watched Gideon's face, a serious and concentrated study. Hachoz lifted his own hand, pointed to the snake symbol on the map, and then to his chest. He whispered something in his native tongue. Gideon didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture. He understood the connection. He found himself looking at the boy not as a complication, but as a person, as a mirror. They were two lost souls, adrift in a world of hard truths and sharper edges. He realized that this wasn't about gold. It was about trust. It was about a bargain made in silence, a promise to a ghost, and a boy who knew a different kind of home. Gideon reached out and laid his hand, a heavy, warm weight, on the boy's shoulder. The boy didn't flinch. He just watched. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with 1,000 things unsaid, 1,000 miles to travel, 1,000 debts to pay. The next morning, Gideon found the boy sitting on the back steps, a piece of charcoal in his hand. He was drawing the canyon from the map, but not the way it was on the page. He was drawing it from memory, with an intimate knowledge that Gideon couldn't comprehend. The lines were sharp, the shadows deep, and the details of rock formations and a hidden spring were so precise they could have been a photograph. Gideon knelt beside him, the dust cool and fine under his knees. He looked from the drawing to the boy's earnest face, and a new kind of certainty settled over him. This was not a map. This was a memory. Gideon looked at the drawing, then at the boy. He remembered the feeling of failure, the way it had tasted like dust and grief for years. But looking at the boy's face, at the confident strokes of the charcoal, he felt something else. A flicker of something warm and hopeful, like a lantern being lit in a dark room. The town could wait. The old debts could wait. He knew what he had to do now. He had to listen. He had to follow. He had to be a different kind of sheriff, a different kind of man. He had to go to the canyon. The answer was not on the map. It was in the hands of the boy who held it. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a different kind of promise, one he had to follow. A dry wind smelling of sage and hot rock whipped through the empty streets of Pecan. Gideon had spent the morning gathering supplies, not for the town, not for the law, but for a journey he hadn't yet named. He'd packed a mule with bedrolls, tins of beans, and a small sack of jerky that Hachoz had watched him assemble with a quiet intensity. Cole stood in the doorway of the jailhouse, his arms crossed over his chest, a silent question in his posture. "You're not going alone," Cole said, his voice flat. Gideon didn't look at him. He was cinching his saddlebag, his movements efficient and practiced. "No," he said, and the word hung in the air, a final and unshakable truth. "I'm taking the boy." Cole pushed off the doorframe, the boots scuffing the dusty earth. Gideon, this is a fool's errand. That map, it's just a scribble. It's nothing. You're chasing a ghost. Gideon finally looked at his deputy, his gaze steady and tired. We're all chasing ghosts, Cole. Some of us just admit it. He gestured toward the boy, who was standing beside the mule, his hand resting on the animal's flank, a silent communion passing between them. That boy's been to a different kind of hell. He's got a memory of a place that feels like a home. I'm gonna see it. It's the right thing to do. Cole didn't argue further. He'd known Gideon long enough to know when a man had made his mind up. He just watched as the old sheriff and the young boy walked out of town, their shadows long against the morning light. The quiet departure was a moral choice, a deliberate severing of the past, and a step into the unknown. They left the town behind, its quiet desperation and its bitter memories, and headed toward the box canyon the boy had so meticulously drawn. The map was tucked inside Gideon's shirt, pressed against his heart, a fragile guide in a world of hard edges. The journey was a long conversation in silence. They walked for 2 days, the sun a relentless hammer on their backs. The landscape shifted from the flat, scrub-dotted plains to rolling hills of shale and sandstone, the colors of the rock deepening from a pale tan to a bruised purple. Hachoz walked with a natural, unhurried gait, his eyes scanning the horizon, a silent guide in a world Gideon thought he knew. When they stopped to rest, Hachoz would find a shaded ledge or a small, wind-scoured cave, always with a certainty that Gideon couldn't fathom. At night, as Gideon mended a tear in his pants or cleaned his boots, the boy would trace the constellations, his finger pointing to the stars with a knowledge that was ancient and profound. Gideon watched him, a quiet awe blooming in his chest. He was not just following a boy, he was following a different kind of wisdom. The canyon, when they reached it, was not what Gideon had expected. The drawings had captured its essence, but not its scale. The walls rose like cathedral spires, the rock a mosaic of rust and ochre. The air was cool and still, a sanctuary from the relentless sun. Hachoz walked ahead, his steps light and sure, as if this place was a memory in his very bones. He didn't hesitate, didn't look back. Gideon followed, his boots crunching on the loose gravel, a quiet trust blooming in his chest. They made camp near a small, clear spring the boy had drawn with such care. The water was cool and sweet, and Gideon drank deeply, a silent thanks to the boy's detailed memory. The air, tasting of minerals and damp earth, was a welcome relief. As night fell, Hachoz took a stick and began to draw in the dirt again, a new pattern of symbols and lines that Gideon hadn't seen before. They were different from the map, more complex, and Gideon felt a familiar frustration rise in him, a tightening in his jaw. He knew so little, understood so little. He was a blind man following a child's hand. He pushed the feeling down, a quiet internal struggle. He had to trust. He had to let go of his need for control. The next morning, the boy led them deeper into the canyon. They passed strange, wind-scoured rock formations, and the air grew colder. The drawings had been a guide, but the reality of the landscape was an intimidating maze of shadows and sheer rock faces. Gideon felt a pang of doubt, the old ghosts whispering. This was a fool's errand. He was an old man, chasing a myth with a boy who spoke a language of dirt and charcoal. But then, Hachoz stopped. He pointed to a small crevice in the canyon wall, a dark mouth that seemed to exhale a cold, damp breath. The snake symbol was carved into the rock above it, faded and half obscured by moss. The sight of it was a quiet disruption, a moment of profound recognition. Gideon felt a shiver run down his spine. This was no drawing. This was a landmark. He looked at the boy, who was watching him with a patient, knowing gaze. It was a moment of truth, a choice between fear and faith. Gideon's hand went to his pistol, his fingers wrapping around the cold, familiar steel of the grip. The weight of it was a comfort, a reminder of who he was, a lawman, a protector, a man of action. He could feel the old instincts, the readiness for a fight. But then he looked at the boy. He thought of his own failure, the second of hesitation that had cost a life. This was not a moment for violence. This was a moment for something else. He deliberately, slowly, uncurled his fingers from the grip, the metal cool against his palm. He pushed the pistol back into its holster, a soft leather whisper in the silence. He chose to be a man. He chose to trust. He ducked his head and stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was still and cool, smelling of damp earth and old stone. The tunnel was narrow at first, but it soon opened into a large cavern. In the center of the cavern, a stream of water, fed by the spring, ran through a series of rock basins. And there, glinting in the faint light filtering from the entrance, were veins of gold, thick and undeniable. It wasn't a lost mine. It was a secret place, a sacred place. The gold was part of the rock, not piled in sacks, not waiting to be plundered. It was just there, a beautiful, quiet truth. Hachoz stood still, his small body silhouetted against the light. He didn't seem surprised or excited. He seemed at peace. He looked at Gideon, then at the gold, and finally, he spoke a single word in his language. The word was a gentle sound, a name. He wasn't talking about the gold. He was talking about the stream, the rock, the home. The gold was not the point. The place was the point. The boy had brought Gideon to a place of profound beauty, a place of peace. And the gold was just a part of the landscape. Gideon reached out and touched a vein of gold, the cold metal a shock against his warm skin. It was real. The legend was real. The ghost was real. And in that moment, he realized that the ghost he had been chasing, the one from his past, was not gone. It was just different now. It was no longer a weight, a failure. It was a compass, a guide that had led him here, to a place of redemption, a place of quiet forgiveness. The choice had been simple, trust or fear. And he had chosen trust, and it had led him home. The old sheriff looked at the boy, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something more than just weariness. He felt a quiet, hopeful tenderness. It was a feeling that had no words, a feeling of shared obligation and a promise of a future that had no end. He knew what he had to do now. He had to honor this place. He had to protect it. And he had to find a way to honor the boy who had shown him the way. That night, they made a fire at the mouth of the cavern. The flames danced, casting long, shifting shadows that made the gold within the rock seem to pulse with a life of its own. Gideon watched Hachoz, who sat with his back to the fire, staring out at the inky blackness of the canyon. The boy's stillness was profound, a quiet communion with the land. Gideon didn't interrupt. He just stoked the fire, his mind replaying the moment they'd stepped into the cavern, the shock of seeing the gold not as a treasure, but as a part of a beautiful, hidden world. He pulled a tin of beans from his pack and set it over the fire. As it warmed, a low rumble echoed through the canyon. Hachoz didn't move. Gideon looked up, his hand going instinctively to his pistol. The sound wasn't a rock slide or a predator. It was the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves. He pushed the boy gently behind a large boulder, his body a silent shield. He was a sheriff again, his old instincts kicking in, a familiar tightness in his gut. 3 riders emerged from the darkness. They were rough men, their faces grimed with dust, their clothes worn and patched. They dismounted and walked toward the fire, their movements radiating a quiet desperation. One of them, a gaunt man with a nervous tic, spoke first. "Sheriff," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Heard you were out here. Heard you had a map. Heard you found it." Gideon didn't reply. He just stood by the fire, his hands at his sides, his stance a silent warning. He felt the cold air on his face, the heat of the fire on his back, a silent duel of 2 separate truths. The men weren't looking at him. Their eyes were fixed on the mouth of the cavern, the faint glow of the gold within. The gaunt man took a step closer, his twitching fingers flexing and unflexing at his sides. "We don't want any trouble, Sheriff. We just want a piece of what's ours." The word ours hung in the air, a lie and a threat. Gideon looked at their faces, at the hollow desperation in their eyes, and saw the same greed he had chased for years, the same hunger that had led to so much bloodshed. This was the moment, the moral choice. He could defend the place with force, with the violence he knew so well, or he could find a different way. He looked at the boulder, at the small shadow of the boy, and knew what he had to do. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, a silent negotiation of wills. The other two men shifted their weight, their hands hovering near their own holsters. Gideon held their gaze, a man made of stone, unmoving. He took a slow, deliberate step away from the cavern, away from the gold. He looked at the men, his face unreadable. He felt the weight of his lie before he spoke it, a strange, hollow feeling in his gut. For a man who had sworn an oath to the truth, it was a heavy burden, but he bore it for the sake of a promise he had made to a ghost and a boy. "There's nothing to find," he said, his voice low and steady. "The map was a lie. A dead end. We're going back to town." The men exchanged glances. The gaunt man spat on the ground, the sound a sharp punctuation in the silence. "Don't lie, Sheriff. We know what's in there." Gideon shook his head. "You're wrong. It's just a cave. No gold, just rock and water." He gestured toward his mule. "We're leaving at first light. You can do what you want, but you'll be wasting your time." He turned his back on them and walked to the fire, picking up the tin of beans as if the conversation was over. The audacity of it, the simple, quiet defiance, hung in the air. The men hesitated, their greed warring with their distrust. They had followed a rumor, a whisper. They hadn't seen the gold for themselves. And they were facing a man who had the stillness of a stone, a man who seemed to have no fear and no doubt. The gaunt man's shoulders sagged. He turned and walked back to his horse. The other two followed, their hopes deflating like a popped balloon. They mounted their horses and rode away, their hooves a retreating echo in the silence. Gideon watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't even raised his voice. He had won through honesty and a quiet courage. He had protected the place not with force, but with the truth. He turned and looked at Hachoz. The boy had emerged from behind the boulder, his eyes wide and bright. He looked from Gideon to the empty space where the men had stood, and then back at the sheriff. A small, trusting smile touched his lips, a gentle nod of his head. He seemed to understand. He seemed to understand that Gideon hadn't protected the gold. He had protected the home. The quiet tenderness that had been budding in Gideon's heart bloomed. He walked to the boy, knelt down, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is yours," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is your home, and no one is going to take it from you." The boy reached up and took Gideon's hand, a small, trusting gesture. He held on tight, a silent promise. And in that moment, the ghost of the girl he had failed was finally, truly gone. It was replaced by the warm, living weight of a hand, a promise of a future, a mutual obligation. The gold wasn't a curse. It was a blessing. It was a symbol of trust, a monument to a gentle resolution. The sheriff had found his peace, and the boy had found his protector. They would stay for a while. They would rest, and they would figure out what to do next. Together. The lantern was turned down low, but the room was no longer dark. Gideon woke with the sun, the air crisp and clean. He looked at the boy, who was already up and staring at the faint golden light spilling from the cavern. The boy turned and met Gideon's eyes. There was no fear in them, only a quiet, settled hope. The sheriff's failure, that long-ago memory, finally felt like a distant echo. The quiet resolution of the night before had replaced it with a tangible, living purpose. The boy wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a silent partner, a part of Gideon's new story. They would stay here for a while, a few weeks, maybe longer. Gideon would teach the boy to mend a fence, to build a sturdy fire, to speak a few words of English. He'd teach him how to use a rifle for hunting, not for violence. Gideon would find the old knowledge coming back to him, the things he'd forgotten in the long, weary years of being a lawman. And the boy, in turn, would teach him. He would teach Gideon how to read the language of the land, how to find water where there was none, how to see the unseen. He'd show Gideon the old ways, the secrets of the earth. They would build something here, not a mine, but a home. A small cabin by the spring, its walls made of the very wood and stone of the canyon. A garden planted in the rich earth near the water's edge. Gideon imagined the boy's quiet smile as they worked side by side, two solitary souls forging a new purpose from the ashes of their pasts. The gold would stay where it was, a secret treasure, a quiet, peaceful truth. It wasn't something to be taken, to be sold, or to be fought over. It was a part of this place, a beautiful and hidden monument to a legacy of a different kind. It was a new beginning, a legacy of quiet trust and a gentle, earned tenderness. And the gold would stay where it was, a quiet, peaceful truth, a secret for a man who had finally found his own. You've been listening to The Sheriff Found a Comanche Orphan with a Map to Gold, an installment in our Wild West Legacy series. If you'd like to hear more stories of hope, struggle, and redemption from the American West, find the full playlist linked in the description below.